questions. We're now going to move on to the next speaker, and that's Maya Kearney from the American University of Washington, D.C. And she's going to be talking about carceral immobilities across within spaces unknown, the fractured reentry landscape in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me, everyone. I am a baby geographer, so I'm very honored to be amongst all of these senior scholars who do amazing work and definitely have had an impact on what I'm trying to do with carceral geography in my analyses and my larger dissertation project. So my research motivations are that I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and I am a trained sociocultural anthropologist where I examine the carceral state through the materiality of political economic processes to explore place-based meanings of the cultural experiences of formerly imprisoned individuals, also referred to as returning citizens in Washington, D.C. So the burgeoning subdiscipline of carceral geography has provided me with a theoretical and analytical toolkit to unpack the unique history and information of the DC carceral state and the socio-spatial drivers of DC having the highest rate of incarceration in the country, if not the world, with a rate of 1,153 per 100,000 residents. My dissertation project will build on this preliminary work to develop a conceptual framework of DC's carceral landscape through the lived experiences of returning citizens, specifically the intersections of place, identity, and belonging, to explore the housing challenges of prisoner reentry in DC. Prisoner reentry is one of the most pressing social justice issues in the US today, with continued high rates of recidivism that call for more critical examinations of the processes and relationships pre, during, and post-incarceration that are embedded in a punitive system of socio-spatial exclusion. The transformation of DC's political economic landscape over the past 20 years and the exacerbated structural inequalities experienced by historically Black communities as a result provides a site for the study of reentry as a feature of carceral space under neoliberal governance. The goal of this talk is to introduce a conceptualization of DC's unique carceral landscape through a socio-spatial analysis that considers the disciplinary movement patterns of residents reintegrating from Federal Bureau of Prison facilities around the country. So I want to give a brief history of the DC carceral system, since I believe it's relatively unknown due to most states having their own prison, well, all states having their own prison system except for DC, due to a history of federal entanglement in the administrative and financial management of DC, as well as how DC is known as a federal district due to the governmental powers that are housed there. So in 1838, the first jail opened for DC, which was operated by the U.S. Army on the current site of the National Building Museum, and it was known as the slave pen, where the majority of people that were incarcerated there were viewed as not, or were charged with not having a quote-unquote master. In 1875, a second jail opened called Reservation 13 on the current site of the DC jail. And by 1895, reports of overcrowding and unsanitary conditions at the jail and workhouse were reported. And this caused some issues in terms of how they should go about managing the incarcerated population, where a presidential commission formed under Theodore Roosevelt in 1908 was formed to address the overcrowding. The commission recommended construction of DC's own prison, and this was under a progressive era reform movement of rehabilitation, trade skills, and less idleness for inmates, as well as open air design of correctional facilities. So in 1910, 1,150 acres of land was bought north of the Occoquan River in Lorton, Virginia, to build a new workhouse. Prisoners did all of the labor by hand to build temporary wooden structures and eventual permanent brick buildings that stand today. In 1912, a women's workhouse was built about 1,000 feet from the men's workhouse. In 1916, by 1916, the workhouse expanded into 3,200 acres, known as the Lorton Correctional Complex. And by 1968, Lawrence became home for up to 7 DC correctional facilities, including a penitentiary in 1911, a reformatory in 1916, and a youth center in 1960. By 1972, Lawrence became extremely overcrowded and dysfunctional, where riots occurred by inmates, which included fires and hostages being taken that mirrored the Attica uprising. This resulted in 2 major lawsuits by jail inmates, where conditions of confinement at the Lawrence jail were determined to violate the 8th Amendment. So as a result, the current DC jail was built in 1976, that's known as the Central Detention Facility, or CDF. Again, overcrowding persisted and poor maintenance of the physical structure continued. And the second jail in 1992 was built, called the Correctional Treatment Facility, that opened up next right to the Central Detention Facility, also called CDF. And this in this area of the jail, the building of the jail, is called CDF because it is referring to the Correctional Treatment Facility is called that because it focuses on populations that have some type of mental or behavioral health issue or physical health issue, and they need special treatment while they're incarcerated and be separated from the general population at the Central Detention Facility. And in 1997, Lawrence was ordered to close under passage of the 1997 National Capital and Self-Improvement Revitalization Act by President Bill Clinton to address DC's financial mismanagement issues. This was also a result of Lawrence having extreme overcrowding and poor conditions and sanitary conditions and different levels of corruption throughout the facility between its staff and as well as different areas of using the prison as a way to have like underground markets that really created a cycle of violence that spread actually to DC because of the different dealings that were going on inside of the correctional complex. And so under the 1997 Revitalization Act, the last person left Lawrence in 2001. And now in DC, individuals that are convicted of a DC code felony are now sent to BOP facilities throughout the country. And so while DC, during this time in 1997, the federal government took control over many of the main agencies of DC, and most of those have been given back, except for the main functions of the justice system. And this includes the prison system. So now, if you are convicted of a DC code felony, you can be sent to any BOP facility throughout the country. So as you can see, DC's carceral landscape today operates as an expansive, fractured landscape of institutions that function as carceral and transcarceral spaces of control and punishment. As I said, most of DC's justice system is under the control of the federal government. And while there is still local control of the police department, and as well as like the court, the DC Superior Court that handles juvenile cases and some misdemeanor offenses, pretty much everything else is under the federal government, which definitely creates a fragmentation of services, a fragmentation of communication in terms of the needs of the particular inmate population, those under justice supervision, any type of justice involvement. There is definitely a level of miscommunication in the ways that the federal government handles things, which tend to be more punitive in nature, and under DC local understandings of how justice involvement should be handled. And so this graph that I got from a report by the Public Welfare Foundation shows the different pathways of someone who gets caught up in the adult criminal justice system in DC, and how at various levels there's either you are under the control of the local government or the federal government, depending on your offense, or depending on whether or not you are being charged with a felony or a misdemeanor. Oh, and also the halfway houses in DC, which I think is very important, are under the control of the federal government. And this is another area of concern, because when people return home, they're expected to be able to able to get the services in their communities, and be able to be acclimated within the community based on the service delivery that the local providers can give. But because of the federal control over the halfway houses and being incarcerated in BOP facilities, there's definitely a disconnect where there's not a continuum of service delivery pre and post release for the incarcerated population, where when they return home, they have to basically start over again in terms of their reentry planning. And in DC, the men's and women's halfway houses are being contracted under two different organizations. Hope Village was the previous operator that was contracted by the federal government of the men's halfway house, and they actually closed during COVID in May, because they had a long history of mismanagement and violations of their residents' rights in terms of just the overall treatment of them, as well as the COVID related issues in terms of not being able to social distance and not giving people early release due to the conditions of confinement in the halfway houses where people are living in close proximity. And so they closed, and these people that were housed at this particular halfway house were sent to either Baltimore or Delaware. Instead of being given early release, they were sent to Baltimore or Delaware halfway houses to finish their sentences, which caused a lot of tension in terms of advocates who wanted returning citizens to be able to come home and be able home confinement rather than be sent to another halfway house further away from DC, which shows this whole legacy of DC sort of like outsourcing their prisoners to other jurisdictions. And even with the closing of Lorton it's in Virginia. It's about 45 minutes away from DC. So you have this lack of this lack of authority, this lack of competence in the way that DC has been able to manage their prison population and the conditions of confinement for this particular population. So this is a map of the distribution of DC inmates that have been convicted of DC code felonies that are now under the custody of BOP facilities. So at any given time, 4,500 to 5,000 individuals, 96% who are men convicted under DC code, are sent to BOP facilities around the country. And as far as California, as you can see on the map, but most there's a law where they, if possible, people should be sent within 500 miles in DC. So most are sent to Pennsylvania, West Virginia, or North Carolina, but that depends on the security level of the person and also the availability of space in these facilities. But as I said, that people can still be sent as far as California, Texas, wherever there's space, and depending on the basically has a lot to do with the security level of the prison, but also whether or not the person is willing to take them. The prison is willing to take that particular inmate, depending on the situation of that prison at the time in terms of the dynamics of the particular prison population, as well as the staff level of discernment of people from DC being sent basically in unfamiliar territory with folks that are federal, that have been convicted of federal charges, and then how it's a different level of sort of law that is used, even though DC laws have been made more punitive to match federal laws because of the BOP and the federal government taking control of the criminal justice system. But there is still a mismatch in the ways that that DC law and federal law are being used in particular cases in terms of sentences for particular offenses. So it creates some tension between inmates when they could be there for the same crime, but a DC inmate could have lesser time, depending on what the situation is, than somebody who's been convicted under federal charges. So 43% of inmates who were under BOP custody in 2014 were there for nonviolent offenses, which is a pretty large number, considering where you would think that somebody being sent so far away would have, for such a long time, considering it'll be over a year when somebody has to, if you're convicted of a felony, you're most likely going to be sent to somewhere for over a year. And most of the time, these folks, when they're sent to federal BOP facilities, they're serving at least 5 to 10 years, and for most of the time for drug offense, nonviolent drug offenses. And there's been a 47% increase in the time served in prison for DC Code felony, for people being sentenced under DC Code felonies between 2017 and 2013. So this shows that there's been a push in terms of, because of the DC Code and the federal law not being on the same in terms of level of punitiveness, that there's been a push to DC's laws to be more in line with that, and mainly people have been incarcerated for longer periods of time.
5 minutes left.
Okay. So each year, about 2,400 people return to DC from BOP facilities into community spaces in DC. And what I would say about this whole distribution map is that, drawing on Moran and colleagues' analysis of Russia's prison transport system, I view the vast geographical distribution of DC's code offenders across the U.S. That characterizes its intracontinental reach of its carceral geography as an example of liminal space and disciplined mobility. And inmates are first transported to a federal transfer center in Oklahoma City, where they are processed and assigned to any other BOP facilities who are, federally contract or just BOP prisons around the country, and they can be sent as far as California. But this can all, like I said, could be determined by whatever is available. And the FTC, I view it as a liminal space where the BOP, when you're in BOP custody, but you're not yet incarcerated in your permanent location, or you're not free. So you're being conditioned in a way to serve your time at a federal prison through this disciplined mobility of being transferred to the FTC, and also being transferred again to a permanent facility. And also Gill's analysis of the ways mobility is used punitively in carceral spaces helps to illuminate these processes even further as a source of discomfort, invisibility, and exposure, where there's discomfort and just being sent. You don't know where you're being sent when you're convicted of a DC Code felony and you have this under prison. So you don't know where you're being sent throughout the country. You go to Oklahoma City first. You're mixed in with other people convicted of federal charges from around the country. And this is like totally opposite of what folks who are typically under state felony laws, they're sentenced, they're serving their prison sentences within their state. But in DC, people are sent to other states, and so, or other areas of the country. Concerning DC is not a state, and so you have this unfamiliarity and discomfort of being in an unknown place, not knowing where you're going, and then this whole invisibility of your family not even knowing where you're going, and the whole process is sort of is the whole process is not as transparent as it could be in terms of the way that you are the way that you're going to be, the conditions of your incarceration and where you will be when you're serving your time. And it's also the lack of communication that happens between the BOP and the local DC government in terms of how the people under BOP custody are being treated, as well as the conditions of the prisons that they are in.
2 minutes left.
Thank you. And also just the overall exposure of being in a different setting, a different space of a prison where you don't know anybody. There may be some other people from DC there, but there's definitely a type of a lack of connection, or definitely a cultural sense of community that you may have if you were sentenced to a facility in your local community. And so when thinking about reentry and the ways that people return back to DC after going through this whole process of being incarcerated so far away from home, hundreds and sometimes even thousands of miles away from home, they often return back to securitized spaces. Often these are historically Black communities that have been impacted by gentrification. And so you have a whole era now in DC of redevelopment where communities of color, specifically Black communities, working class communities, have been displaced. About 20,000 Black people have been displaced in DC between 2000 and 2013, and they are now being hyper surveilled by police to protect the property as well as the cultural and social interests of the white majority white affluent class that has entered their community and now transformed it to meet their own needs and tastes. And so you also have issues with reentry, where when people come back to a community that they thought that they once thought was home, and now they come back to a community where there's people that they don't even know, and there's a lack of support by their community, as well as considering the needs of reentrants when they come home to meet their basic needs in housing, employment, education, and health. There's a whole way and how we use these different forms of discipline and mobilities to articulate as well as to regulate the ways in which people reenter society from incarceration. And so I will end with second to last slide in terms of intersecting liminalities, the conceptualization of the reentry experience in DC, and how I'm trying to put together all these different forms of liminality to show how they're interconnected in various ways that shape the experience of DC returning citizens. And it's not just separating them and analyzing and considering them in rigid ways, but seeing how there's a fluidity and how they all simultaneously work together to shape the ways that people, the different ways that people are challenging, and as well as like being oppressed by different forms of punitive law, whether it's punitive space and carceral geographies in which they return to when they come home from incarceration. And so you have the typical collateral consequences of a felony conviction, housing, employment, and educational barriers. But you also have the socio-spatial exclusion of incarceration, being far from your family and friends, and hyper surveillance of your communities, as well as the residential segregation of coming back to gentrified communities. And these embodied forms of marginalization due to the stigma of having a felony record, and ways that this can definitely hinder one's ability to feel confident and being able to integrate back into society, and maybe sometimes even sacrificing their needs to be able to prove that they're changed ideal, an ideal citizen, to be able to fit back into society. And all this has to do with a fragmentation of one's sense of identity, place, and belonging. That's all tied to one's ability to be able to cultivate a sense of independence and be able to find different resources and ways of building social networks and building on your family networks that are also strained due to incarceration and the security that you need from your family and supported bonds to be able to reintegrate successfully. And also it ties to just the racialized gender specific stigmatizations of people who have, especially Black women and men, who have some type of stigma or label attached to them, other than poverty, other than racism, but also now having a felony record. You have these different expectations based on gender roles of being a mother, but now that's hindered by your felony record, not being able to be a provider, but also this goes with men and being able to protect and being able to provide for their families as well. How these different forms of emasculation can be cultivated through different discrimination and violences people experience while trying to reintegrate.
That's really interesting, Maya. Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I cut you off there, because otherwise we won't have time for questions? That was really, really interesting. I just wanted to kind of summarize, I guess, in the sense that I thought it was really fascinating how you had kind of carceral immobilities in your title, but then you were very much talking about huge underlying currents of actual mobility, of kind of, I guess, outsourcing prisoners to other states, how the mobility of re-entry kind of works with prisoners' identities and so on. And any connections to the other two papers, for example, Lauren's presentation on fractured landscapes for migrant detainees, which must be relatively similar, I guess, and the kind of processes of invisibility through prisoners' intense mobility. So we have one question about saying, can you tell us a little bit more on how someone goes about the process of trying to map and chart these different pathways? And is it possible to follow different and individual trajectories through that? Could you say a bit more about that, Maya? Thanks.
Yes. So it's really hard to track people that are within the BOP system because, as I said, there's a lack of transparency, and that's one of the main issues that a lot of the reentry focused stakeholders in DC have with trying to serve the needs of those returning from BOP facilities. And in terms of the data that is collected, you have to go through sort of these bureaucratic paths to be able to locate it, but especially when it comes to knowing exactly where, like for instance, if you have a loved one that is incarcerated at a BOP facility, sometimes there's different ways that you have to navigate the system to be able to even find your loved one in the first place. So for like research purposes, I'm trying to definitely, that's one of the areas of that's one of the areas that I'm struggling with in terms of how I'll be able to locate different pathways throughout the system, maybe using someone as, as a case study, but because of different laws and different laws of privacy, of confidentiality, in terms of people who are incarcerated, that's going to be something that I have to work through. But I think a lot of the data that I've been able to pull is basically through my own experience of being able to do research on reentry and working with the community organizations that provide services to the returning citizen population in DC, and being able to it's not official data in the sense of the macro level data of everybody, of the distribution of inmates and their different paths based on the macro level data that could be provided by BOP, because the BOP doesn't even provide that data to the DC government, because they don't even there's also a issue with them not even telling the DC local government when somebody is being released from BOP facility, so they can prepare for their arrival and give them the services that they need.
Okay, yeah, I get you. Thanks. And another question was from Edward Farmer, who asked about the kind of level of success of reentry. I don't know if you can say a little bit about that, if you get any sense of that so far, and how much people are assisted in Washington, D.C. with reentry. So the kind of more, I guess, empirical aspects.
Okay. Thank you for that question. And so in terms of the reentry success in DC, it's recidivism is still an issue as it is nationally in DC. And so I believe there's a 62%, yes, a 62% rearrest rate in DC. And they don't even have the data, is not available for BOP, the BOP population, but for the Department of Correction, it's a 62% rearrest rate in 3 years in DC. And so when conducting research on community service organizations that provide services to returning citizens in DC, one of the main things is that they don't have the funding to be able to provide more services and more of a wraparound service delivery for reentrants. So it has a lot to do with money and the distribution of resources for that particular population and awareness of it.
That's really fascinating. And I guess that's a good kind of lead over to the previous papers that were thinking about financialization. And I think that's very much also a factor here. Unfortunately, we're almost at the end of the session, so I just wanted to thank all the presenters very